Hi guys, it's been a hot minute since I last did a discography ranking, and I decided that I may as well get stuck into what I have often considered to be one of my favourite bands, and certainly the band that has influenced my musical taste the most, the fabulous Dream Theater. Dream Theater was my introduction to prog metal, and arguably the band that made me take progressive music more seriously in general. They are who I would point the finger to if someone was to ask me, who's your band? And with that attribution comes the burden of being extra critical and having their works come under far greater scrutiny than most bands do for me. To that end, don't expect me to be super cuddly and positive to every entry on this list. But do bear in mind that ultimately I love this band, and when they do things I don't like, I'm more frustrated than I am annoyed. So anyway, enough with my waffling, let's get to the rankings. At number 15 it's self-titled. Someone had to be last, and honestly for me, this one is last by a somewhat considerable margin. I don't hate this album, it's perfectly okay for the most part, I just nothing this album. It's a Dream Theater record that exists. It has John Petrucci playing the guitar and Jordan Rudess doing widdly keyboard parts with more notes than is truly necessary. James LaBrie does his level best to sound like his old self and doesn't do a really great job of it. Look, I don't want to pummel this album whilst it's down, it's not completely without merit. The opening track of False Awakening Suite is one of the coolest introductions to a Dream Theater album. It's hooky, exciting and immediate with some incredible riffs and dynamite atmospherics. But honestly, it's all downhill for me from there, with some of the most generic, uninspired songs in the band's entire career. The production irks me. The compositions feel almost pre-rendered and generated by an AI that's been fed 1,000 hours of the band's music, and ultimately the album leaves me feeling virtually nothing. Even the 22-minute-long Illumination Theory gives me cause to shrug. The big orchestral part feels cynical and soulless, written by someone who understands human emotion on paper, but not how to actually elicit a response from a real person. Self-Titled is the only Dream Theater album I actively avoid listening to, so for that reason alone it kinda had to be in the last spot. Number 14. The Astonishing. I've seen a lot of other lists, and a lot of other lists have this one at the very bottom position. And let me tell you, I see you, I understand you, and I absolutely appreciate why this is often cited as the band's biggest mistake. I honestly don't hate this one. I think it's bold, creative, exciting in parts, and ambitious as all hell. I just don't think it was particularly well executed, and with a bit of trimming, some alterations to the structuring here and there, this could easily have been a top 5 album for me. When it first came out, I loved it, and listened to it a whole bunch, but The Astonishing hasn't aged well, and for me that's down to one simple thing. It's just too goddamn long. There are feature films shorter than this album. It's 2 hours and 10 minutes long for crying out loud, with about zero attempt at editing or trimming any of the excess weight or bloated parts, making for an experience that's honestly just draining to listen to at times because it just keeps on going. There is an amazing single disc album hiding somewhere on this record, and one day I'll eventually make a fan edit playlist of how to make this into one of the band's finest albums. Because honestly, LaBrie is incredible on this, taking it upon himself to voice each and every character in the admittedly ridiculous narrative, and you have to admire the guts of the band to make an album that makes the average Aerion release feel minimalist in comparison. Number 13, it's Systematic Chaos. Oh, my relationship with this album is particularly all over the place, as quite frankly, In the Presence of Enemies Parts 1 and 2 are some of my favourite things the band has ever done, and The Ministry of Lost Souls makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. But then there's everything in between, with what I consider to be some of the most offensively awful things the band has ever committed to recording. Forsaken is awful, a song that reeks of a Wish.com version of Evanescence. There's Constant Motion, also known as the Golly Gee, I Wish We Were a Thrash Metal Band song. The Dark Eternal Night, which is the most unintentionally hilarious attempt at being brutal that I've ever heard. Then there's Repentance, also known as the Snoozorama section of the 12 Steps suite, and Prophets of War, the embarrassing, edgy political statement song that I would expect present-day Muse to be farting out. So, why isn't this in my last place after my glowing review of more than half the tracks on this album? Because, quite frankly, In the Presence of Enemies and The Ministry of Lost Souls are some of the best songs the band has ever written, and I cherish them wholeheartedly, and even if the rest of the album is the big bag of stinky ball sweat, there's at least half an hour of S-tier Dream Theater to be found on this album. Number 12. A View from the Top of the World. So, here it is, as of the time this video going live, the most recent of all of the band's output, and perhaps my first controversial placement. I know a lot of people have hailed this album as a triumphant return to form for the band, and how they finally recaptured the spirit of their glory days, and how everything's going to be sunshine and puppies from here on out. I mean, it's fine. It's a competent, well-put-together, well-produced and great-sounding album, sure. James is at his best in years, Mangini finally sounds less like a drum machine and more like a real person, and they finally shed their attempts to sound badass, which is something a nerdy progressive metal band should never be trying to do anyway. But honestly, there's still a lack of inspiration on this album. In looking towards their past selves, I feel this album suffers quite a lot, feeling like a retreading of albums that were simply better than what they've done here. I mean, honestly, despite being out for 3 years now, I still struggle to recall any significant part of the 20-minute title track, Epic, where I could probably a cappella the entirety of A Change of Seasons or Octavarium for you if my life was on the line. But no, this is just a perfectly fine, competent, pleasant, but ultimately slightly boring album that lacks the bite or the teeth of the past selves they're clearly trying to emulate here. Number 11, it's Distance Over Time. Another of the more recent crop of releases from the band, Distance Over Time saw Dream Theater trying to embrace shorter strong structures and more accessible music than what we're generally used to, with not a single song going over the 10-minute mark and the majority sitting somewhere between 4 to 6 minutes long. I honestly really enjoyed this shorter form of songwriting from the band, as I've long felt that they were feeling duty-bound to creating the long, sweeping, meticulous passages of music that just kept on going and never really ended up anywhere. So for the band to put the focus more on immediate songwriting was, for me at least, a breath of fresh air. Untethered Angel is one of my favourite openers from the band, and punchy offerings like Paralysed, Room 137 and S2N really hit a chord with me. The record does suffer from feeling a little bit aimless towards the end, and honestly overlong, because as much as the band were clearly trying to put out a more straightforward, accessible album, it still clocks in at a 56-minute long album, or an hour if you've the bonus track version with Viper King on it. I think that if they'd commit to just putting out a 40-minute long, 3 to 4 minute long songs album with a focus on more traditional metal song structuring, I would be ranking this one much higher. As it is though, it's a slightly bloated but ultimately enjoyable romp with some great riffs, memorable passages, and feels the strongest indicator as to what the band should be aiming for in their future. At least in my opinion anyway. Number 10, it's Black Clouds and Silver Linings. Mike Portnoy's swan song, and for me the most memeable of all of the band's albums. Make no mistake, we're in the top 10 now, so I pretty much love all of these records, albeit with some caveats here and there. But nothing makes me laugh more than this album, be it intentionally or not. Be it the hysterical death growls from Portnoy on opening track Nightmare to Remember, or the bizarre and what the absolute ball-buggery lyrics on album closer The Count of Tuscany, this record has more than its fair share of bewildering moments across its beefy 75-minute runtime. Now it does suffer a little bit of the same problems from Systematic Chaos for me, insofar as that it is bookended by tracks that are so much stronger than what lies in between. But this disparity isn't felt anywhere near as much on this album. I mean, yes, Wither sucks, let's not pretend otherwise, but A Rite of Passage is pretty killer, and The Shattered Fortress is an amazing payoff and conclusion to the 12 Steps suite. Controversially though, I generally don't enjoy The Best of Times, and while I appreciate the message behind it and how important of a song this is for Mike Portnoy, I think it's a good 10 minutes longer than it needs to be, and feels like it was completely overwritten, and I feel that this kind of introspective, deeply personal kind of song simply doesn't fit on the rest of the album. It's perfectly fine, but I certainly don't get the emotional impact that it was clearly written to have. The Count of Tuscany makes up for it though, and every time I ever go and buy a bottle of red, I'm inevitably going to say to the long-suffering friends around me as I pour them a glass, "Come and have a taste, a rare vintage. All the finest wines improve with age." Number 9, it's When Dream and Day Unite. Possibly another controversial placement. I honestly, truthfully love this album, and honestly, truthfully love Charlie Dominici on this album. Do I think he would have been a good long-term fit for the band? God, no! Imagining this guy lasting more than this debut album is just something I can't fathom. But for what he gave to this debut, I honestly love him. A Fortune in Lies, Eats a Jam, The Killing Hand, Afterlife, Only a Matter of Time, all certified bangers and all absolute classic Dream Theater songs. And you've got to remember, these guys were barely into adulthood when they recorded these songs, and to be able to play like that when they were so young, it's no wonder they all flourished into such accomplished musicians. A lot of lists tend to put this album at the very bottom of the pile, citing it as not being what Dream Theater are, and that it doesn't have enough of the band's DNA for it to be considered amongst their real albums. And frankly, if y'all are gonna straight-facedly tell me that the bland, insipid, self-titled record is better than the emotional punch of a band trying to prove themselves to the world for the first time, then frankly I'm going to pout furiously in your general direction and ultimately respect your opinion even if I don't agree with it. Yeah, I'm a big fan of this record, I will regularly revisit it, and it will always have a very special place for me in the band's catalogue. Number 8, it's Train of Thought. Good old Train of Thought, when the band put the metal before the prog and fired out their edgiest, most naughty and hard album they've released to date. Yeah, metal! I should hate this one, as I've often thought Dream Theater were at their weakest when they put metal first and prog second. But man, something about this album still hits true every time I listen to it. There's an uncomplicated rawness to the album, a kind of juvenile angst that against all odds actually works in the album's favour. Although that being said, I do feel that the weakest tracks are where the angst gets a little bit too raw, and the lyrics and overall mood of As I Am and Honour Thy Father do rub me the wrong way at times. But the music is absolutely killer, so I can almost forgive them, you know. This album is all about endless sacrifice, stream of consciousness, and In the Name of God, though, all of which I would name amongst my favourite ever Dream Theater songs. Endless Sacrifice especially is one of the unsung gems of the band that always seems to get overlooked. But I have been obsessed with this song for a good 15 years now, and that obsession ain't going anywhere. Ultimately, Train of Thought is a balls-to-the-wall, no-holds-barred experience and the perfect demonstration of the band's metallic side on full display. It's a little cringy in the lyrics department, but hey, that's prog for you. It's still a hell of a ride, and a true showcase for John Petrucci's incredible arms. At number 7, we've got Falling into Infinity. More controversy, more scandal, more list positioning that goes against the grain. Yes, my darling viewers, I adore Falling into Infinity, and I am not afraid to say it. Often considered one of the weakest links in the band's chain, and not without its fair share of record label drama, I might add, I will always champion this as the band's most underrated album. It weirdly sits in an island alone, being the only studio album to feature Derek Sherinian on keyboards. I felt that he left such an indelible mark on the band's sound that it honestly saddens me that he only got to perform on this and A Change of Seasons and a couple of live albums, whatever. But it's his contributions here that really made me love this album. Now, Kevin Moore will always be my numero uno DT keyboard guy, but something about Derek's playing style felt so raw and impassioned, especially when compared to the overtly technical Jordan Rudess who would replace him on subsequent releases. So, despite the troubled production of this album, we still got some certified classics like Hollow Years, Lines in the Sand, Take Away My Pain, and Trial of Tears, as well as some underappreciated gems like New Millennium, Anna Lee, and Peruvian Skies. For me, there's not a single track on this album that I don't like. I mean, sure, I prefer some to others, but I think this is the first album on this list where I can objectively argue that every song has merit, and for that reason alone, it felt criminal to rank it any lower than this. Number 6, it's Octavarium. I used to argue for a long time that if this had been the last ever Dream Theater album, I wouldn't have been mad at all. Coming out as the last record to be released on the Atlantic label before the band moved to Roadrunner, which at the time was kind of a big deal, Octavarium really felt like it had a sense of closure and finality about it, almost feeling like the band were waving goodbye, ready to sail off into the great wide blue yonder. Now, obviously, they didn't stop making music, as this album came out, 18 years ago, and we've had quite a few records out since then. I adore this album, and feel that it represented a crucial turning point for the band's successes, as it simultaneously saw them embracing a more immediate, influence-driven sound with tracks like I Walk Beside You being evocative of bands like U2, and Panic Attack feeling like early Muse, but in the best possible way. It was the band's way of branching out into more popular sounds without sacrificing any of their existing integrity or style. And then there's the title track, the big kahuna, the Mac Daddy, and my most played Dream Theater song of all time. I'm always torn between calling this or A Change of Seasons as the band's magnum opus, and honestly it all depends if I'm in the mood for prog or for metal. But however you want to look at it, the title track alone is worth your time on this album, and the remaining 51 minutes is just a damn fine album by its own rights. Octavarium just missed out on the top 5 by feeling like a record that is propped up almost a little bit too much by the closing epic, as it does rather diminish the impact of all the songs that came before it. But this is still absolutely top tier Dream Theater and one of my all-time favourites. Number 5. A dramatic turn of events. While I was doing research for this list and trying to figure out where to place everything, I found myself constantly returning to this one, more so than even some of the albums that I placed higher than this one, which really kind of shocked me, I'll be honest. I remember the hype, the nervous excitement and speculation for this album pre-release, as it was the first record to be released after founding father Mike Portnoy had departed, and Mike Mangini taking up his sticks in his absence. I honestly believe that this is the most archetypal, traditional, and accessible of all of the band's prog-heavy releases. It encapsulates their sound, the essence and the identity of the band in their established groove better than anything else. This record feels Dream Theater, it exudes it, personifies it, and perfects it. I will unashamedly champion this album above everything earlier on this list. I think it contains the perfect blend of progressive sensibilities, ballsy metal, fantastic vocal work, memorable keyboards, and dazzlingly complex compositions outside of the top 4 picks on this list. This Is the Life, Bridges in the Sky, Outcry, Far From Heaven, Breaking All Illusions, and Beneath the Surface is such a run of tracks, covering just about every flavour of the band you could possibly hope for, and makes for such an engaging and memorable listening experience. I nearly ranked this one higher, I'll be honest, but the top 4 are so unspeakably timeless and brilliant that the only reason this couldn't unseat them is because I'm more familiar with them than this one. A Dramatic Turn of Events is still an absolutely stonking masterpiece of an album and the perfect jumping in point for a new fan. Number 4, it's Images and Words. Ha! Not number 1! Take that, popular opinion! No, I'm not, in fact, flying in the face of just about every single mainstream list out there for the sake of it. I genuinely believe that this album deserves this position on my list. The term sophomore slump didn't mean a damn thing to Dream Theater. They took all the lessons they learnt from their debut and blasted into the spotlight with their new secret weapon, a certain falsetto-wielding Canadian by the name of Kevin James LaBrie. Now say whatever you will about Mr. LaBrie as he's gotten older, when he first burst out of our speakers back in 1992, his voice was one of the most commanding, powerful, intense and showboating sounds in the world. Hearing him belt out "Watch the Sparrows Falling" on opening track Pull Me Under still gives me chills every time I hear it, and really does showcase just how remarkable a vocalist LaBrie once was. But it's not just LaBrie who made this album so good. How about that bass solo on Metropolis Part 1, the guitar solo on Under a Glass Moon, the keyboards on Learning to Live? This band was on fire. They raised the bar so high on this album from what they gave the world, and when Dream and Day unite, it's almost hard to believe that it's the same band. Every single song on this album is a classic. Every single moment feels so intense and calculating, with an undeniable enthusiasm and a joie de vivre to the entire mood of the record. Now, I absolutely understand why this is considered the cream of the crop by most fans, but for me, the remaining 3 hit me and my taste a teensy bit harder. Number 3, it's 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence. If The Astonishing is a textbook example of how not to do a double album, then 6 Degrees is surely the template for precisely how you should make one. 2002's monster-sized release, clocking in at 96 minutes long with a 42-minute long song on the second CD, was for the longest time the beefiest release in the Dream Theater catalogue, but it did that rare and remarkable thing that must be treasured at all costs. It justified it. 6 Degrees feels like it really earns its runtime, and it's hard to pick which disc is a favourite. On one hand, you've got the first disc, with one of the greatest opening tracks ever with The Glass Prison, and fearlessly experimental and adventurous tracks like Misunderstood and Disappear. But then you've got the massive chungers on disc 2, the absurdly epic and over-the-top title track, a 42-minute journey exploring the depths of mental illness and overcoming the challenges that this can present in life. Both sides are incredible for their own individual reasons, and I will always listen to one after the other, but for me, it's really the title track that makes this album sound so strong and proud in the overall rankings here. As someone who has been suffering with some severe mental health issues in my time on this earth, I find this album a cathartic release and a welcome reminder that I'm not alone with my thoughts and feelings. It is a balm for me, spiritually and emotionally, and this album makes regular rotation in my usual listening habits as it serves as something of a comfort blanket and a reminder that I don't need to let my mental health conditions rule my life. 6 Degrees is one of the most important albums that the band has ever released in my opinion, and has really helped me through some tough spots, which is why I have positioned this as high as I have done. Number 2, it's Awake. Now, you see, the problem with doing a list in this fashion is the more albums you get through, the more obvious it becomes what the next choice is going to be, and when you get to the second spot, if you know the band well enough, you automatically know what the number 1 spot is going to be, and therefore completely destroy all sense of mystery and intrigue that remains. But hey ho, whatevs. This and the top spot are honestly interchangeable for me, and which of these is the number 1 and number 2 pick can change on an hourly basis, so take that for what it is. Awake is a remarkable achievement in progressive metal, taking all the lessons the band learned from Images and Words and flipping all that positivity and upbeat energy and turning into a far darker, more sinister and unsettling experience. I personally love a little bit of darkness to my music, and Awake is that perfect line between edgy and cringy that I love so much. Containing some of my favourite songs not just from Dream Theater, but from music in general, see Scarred, Voices, Lie, Space Divest and The Mirror, Awake is a champion tour de force of compositional excellence, accessibility and the thinnest veil between light and shadow. Every moment of this album toys and plays with the possible slipping off point into the endless void, but never quite plunges into the darkest depths. And it's this constant, masterful blue balling across its 75-minute runtime that makes it such a delight to listen to. This is also the swan song of my dear Kevin Moore, and I will forever miss his beautiful, restrained and tasteful contributions to the band's sound. But I will also be forever grateful that he at least left us with Space Divest, one of the most heart-wrenching, minimalist and affecting songs that the band has ever released. And number 1, you know it guys, it's Metropolis Part 2, Scenes from a Memory. Yes, you sleuthing, intelligent and devastatingly brilliant people, you figured me out. You got me by the short hairs and called my bluff 8 entries ago, I'm sure. Yes, it's the other obvious choice for the top spot, the one that isn't Images and Words. It's the more contemporary and civilised choice for the greatest Dream Theater album of all time. It's Metropolis Part 2, Scenes from a Memory. For me, this album belongs as the dictionary definition of progressive metal concept album. It is a fundamentally flawless record in my eyes, taking absolutely everything that the band had made work for themselves up until this point and crafting it into a mirror-polished, unspeakably brilliant album that they have never been able to do better than. There's the upbeat progressive sensibilities and thematic similarities to Images and Words, the darkness of Awake, and the accessibility of Falling into Infinity, all wrapped up in slick production values, immaculate mastering, and the most bold and adventurous sounds in the band's entire discography. This was the entry point for long-running keyboard wizard Jordan Rudess, and for my money, still his finest work with the band, and back when he still had long hair and no beard, a far cry from his signature look these days. This very much felt like the platform for Rudess to showcase to the world why he was selected to fill the shoes of Sherinian, and that his time in Liquid Tension experiment had really helped solidify him as the perfect fit for the band. But for as good as the music on this album, and make no mistake, it's incredible, It really is the structuring and exploration of the album's centrally running narrative and storytelling that makes this such a memorable experience, and an album that's worth revisiting time and time and time again. I can remember my first real deep dive with this album was just after I'd finished university. I was living with my nan for a while whilst I looked for a home, and I hadn't much of my own personal effects at the time, but what I cherished the most was my CD collection and my little portable stereo. There wasn't a lot to do at my nan's house, so I retreated to music more often than not, and it was during this time, this transitory period of my life, that I started to unravel the story of this album. As I was struggling to find my place in the world at the time, fresh out of higher education with nothing but a piece of paper that said I was reasonably clever, and a desperate desire to make something of myself, the narrative of a man exploring his past life and understanding who he truly was in this world really hit a chord with me. Scenes from a Memory is the most affecting record that the band has ever released, the most affecting record that they will likely have ever released, and stands tall and proud atop the pile as my pick for the best Dream Theater album of all time. So, there you have it. That's my picks for Dream Theater's discography circa August 2023. Of course, my list is purely my list and in no way represents the only acceptable positioning of these albums. So I'd love to hear where these stack up for you, even if you just want to tell me your top 5. Also, what takes of mine do you disagree with? Where do you think I really dropped the ball on this list? I'd love to know why the self-titled album is your favourite. Maybe you'll make me see some of my choices in a different light. Who knows? If you did like this video, please do share it around with anyone else who you think would possibly enjoy it, and please do consider subscribing to the channel for more content. I'm going to leave my link tree down below, where you'll find all the places to find me on social media, as well as a link to my Ko-fi page if you're feeling particularly generous and want to help support the channel. But until next time, guys, as always, keep your rhyme signatures extremely odd.